Okay, so this week we are working our way through gender performance and performativity and really looking at this through Judith Butler's article. I know that she is a difficult person to read, and her writing is very sort of heavy-handed and not very user-friendly necessarily, but I think the ideas at their core are something that we kind of understand in today's day and age, but not something that would have been necessarily seen as straightforward in the 1980s when she writes this article. So this is really one of her first articles about gender performance and performativity, and it really sort of is the foundation for a lot of her other books and articles. But she really becomes this big figure in philosophy, ethics, queer theory, literary theory, and a supporter of lesbian and gay rights, and really sort of is one of the theorists that all people talk about when discussing gender performance as a whole. I stumbled upon this article of hers semi-recently where she comes at this interviewer, which is really funny, about sort of J.K. Rowling and her take on sort of being a TERF, which is let me get it up here for it, which stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist, which is a term I'd never heard before, in that I've never heard it abbreviated as TERF, but calling out sort of J.K. Rowling about this idea and calling her that, and then the interviewer trying to tell her that it's a slur, and then Judith Butler coming at the interviewer about how J.K. Rowling sort of conversations really affect trans people as a whole. So you can definitely take a look at this interview if you want to see Judith Butler totally tear apart Alana Ferber in her literally not understanding Judith Butler's writing at all, or ideas. So it is pretty funny. Especially as I would say Judith Butler has worked very hard to talk about sort of trans gender inclusions in feminist theory in a lot of Judith Butler's writing, and someone made her into an action figure, which is really, really weird. And also like this head, I don't know, what would you call it, a sticker? So be prepared for me to use the Judith Butler head sticker now, from now on. But it really helps for the development of these two big texts where Judith Butler really breaks down how we understand and think about gender socially and historically, and how these constructs have been used in oppression of men and women in a sort of larger scale. So when Judith Butler writes this article in 1988, we're really kind of in the midst, or moving kind of very quickly into the third wave of feminism, which is really kind of starting in the 1990s to around 2012. And there's a lot of rejecting of the concept of feminist, and this is when you start to see that, but also it's really about destabilizing outdated constructs of sexuality, gender, the body, heteronormativity, and the development of individual identity, and really moving away from the second wave of feminism, which is anchored in the personal is political. And we're going to see this as being Generation X, so after baby boomers, but before millennials. And it's really spurred by a couple of different sort of actions and events. Riot Girl, which is in the early 1990s, and then Anita Hill in the trial between her and Clarence Thomas in 1991. And hopefully you have a good idea of what that trial is, and maybe you don't. But this is where we have Anita Hill accusing Clarence Thomas, who's now on the Supreme Court, during his Supreme Court hearing, of sexually harassing her and assaulting her. And this may seem familiar, obviously, because this just happened very recently with Brett Kavanaugh and Christine Blasey Ford. But it did happen 18 years earlier with Anita Hill. And this is really where we see the spur of the third wave of feminism, realizing sort of these intricacies of sexual harassment and sexual abuse in the workplace that's still going on. And Anita Hill getting put on the spot in this trial and sort of used and abused by the way that the people talk to her at this trial. And then to see that 18 years later still, that we're still putting these accused rapists in the Supreme Court to protect our rights, when there's this sort of continued series of abuse, with figures like Anita Hill really pioneering that as a Black woman, which must have been very difficult in a lot of ways. And I've included, she recently was re-interviewed by John Oliver, which I've included. I've also included another link about I think her opening statement, but you can really Google anything to see sort of the questions that she was asked and harassed by the trial as a whole, and really kind of accusing her of a lot of these things, and really sort of trying to make her feel uncomfortable. So Rebecca Walker responds to Clarence Thomas's appointment to the Supreme Court in MS Magazine and really develops this idea of becoming the third wave. So I write this as a plea to all women, especially women of my generation. Let Thomas's confirmation serve to remind you, as it did me, that the fight is far from over. Let this dismissal of women's experience move you to anger. Turn that outrage into political power. Do not vote for them unless they work for us. Do not have sex with them. Do not break bread with them. Do not nurture them if they don't prioritize our freedom to control our bodies and our lives. I am not a post-feminism feminist. I am the third wave. And so, as the second wave was being criticized for being too white, straight, and liberal, and focused on binaries between man and woman, the third wave is really going to break for those constructs. And so the hallmarks of the third wave really are interested in sort of inclusion. So this wave doesn't constitute a whole lot of very specific views and ideas because they didn't want to be tied down to anything too specific, and really sort of engaging with everybody's sort of individual personal experiences. So you'll see that because of intersectionality, women's experiences contains layers of oppression such as gender, race, and class, as we can see with Audre Lorde, Anna Julia Cooper, all of these conversations about continuing to engage with intersectionality. Again, sort of all of these oppressions are interconnected. And I'll show you a couple artists that we can talk about with that as well. And here's Audre Lorde saying, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. We also had conversations about sexual power, discussions of abuse and rape of women and harassment in the workplace, and also the reclaiming of words and ideas, such as reclaiming words like slut and bitch, as well as girls with cyber girls and net girls, obviously with the internet, as well as engaging with sort of sexual clothing, and sort of reclaiming these things as if you want to take them on, you should be able to, as being a feminist and a woman doesn't mean you have to prescribe to a certain ideal. So we have transfeminism with the Transfeminism Manifesto by Emi Koyoma, a movement by and for trans women who view their liberation to be intrinsically linked to the liberation of all women and beyond. Transversal Politics, with talking about women across national, ethnic, and religious boundaries, and listen and participate in dialogue together. Post-colonialism, obviously there was a larger issue with colonialism, especially in the 30s and 40s, still having this British control of countries even in the 20th century seems ridiculous. And so post-colonialism allowed for a breakdown of ethnocentrism and desire to connect with people outside of our own culture, call into question European thoughts and views. Again, thinking about sort of Western art history too, and the way that we talk about art history in general. And again, you can think about even in the 1940s, we have India finally gain its independence from Britain. And so colonialism is still a large part in sort of this post-colonialist age, how much those dialogues have continued into our everyday lives. I was just telling someone that a lot of Indians have British accents. And they were really confused. And I'm like, well, it's because of this colonialism, right? So even the way that the British colonized India, that the British accent has been intrinsically put into the Indian culture because of this colonization, right? And sort of mistreatment of these people. And then, of course, the Rag Girl movement, with bands and women working hard to support women's lives and sex lives, and putting out zines and e-zines to promote these ideas sort of as a whole, and to sort of get those ideas out there through these sort of mass-produced zines. And it's interesting because you have people still trying to sort of disable these ideas of someone like the Riot Girls, because they didn't conform to sort of these particular constructs of what a woman should be. So even in the 1990s, we have these things purveying, and so the third wave is really going to try to break down some of those ideals. So how does that get us then into the conversation about Judith Butler? So Judith Butler's thesis is kind of constituted in these couple of sentences here, this one and then on the next slide, which is that she states that I will try to show some of the ways in which reified and naturalized conceptions of gender might be understood as constituted and hence capable of being constituted differently. Oh, I'm sorry. In the course of making my argument, I will draw from theatrical, anthropological, and philosophical discourses, but mainly phenomenology, to show that what is called gender identity is a performative accomplishment compelled by social sanction and taboo. In its very character as performative resides the possibility of contesting its reified status. And of course, like I said before, this idea of phenomenology is based in kind of philosophy, and is really rooted in conscious experience. So this is a definition here, a philosophical sociology that begins with the individual and his or her own conscious experience as the focus of study, and attempts to avoid prior assumptions, prejudices, and other dogmatic forms of thinking while investigating social behavior. So in looking at these things, right, phenomenology speaks to look at conscious experience and routine daily life. So while it's hard to kind of understand and study someone's sort of conscious experience, and even sort of unconscious experience within that, she's using this as a way to kind of delve into ideas about everyday social life, right? Why are we engaging with the performance of gender as a whole historically, and what does that sort of mean to our conscious and subconscious? Which I know seems complicated, but really it's kind of just about thinking, why are people going on day to day not thinking about things like why only females wear makeup and men don't wear makeup, and all of these sort of quote unquote ideas that are perpetuated through society, right? And obviously in the 21st century, in 2020, we're breaking up those things and understanding that those are not as highly sort of part of male versus females as people think they are, but there's still people who tend to think that that's kind of part of naturalness, or men versus women biologically, right? Which is obviously not true. So, as she says, philosophers rarely think about acting in the theatrical sense, but they do have a discourse of acts that maintains associative semantic meanings with theories of performance and acting. Phenomenological theory of acts by Edmund Husserl, et al. Here seeks to explain the mundane in which social agents constitute social reality through language, gesture, and all manner of social sign. So again, I'm going to show you how we can think about gender performance in the way that it's thought through the body specifically. And that's kind of where Judith Butler really starts to solidify her argument, is in these symbolic ways in which gender is enacted by people without them sort of being aware of it. After sort of talking about this article and thinking about it, I want to reiterate how we talk about performance and performance theory, because in this class we're almost never talking about it in the theatrical sense, in the performances on stage or pretend. And so I'll show you that here. Actually, let me skip forward to it, because we talked about this when we talked about Richard Schechner, but there is a difference between make-believe, which is there are clear distinctions between reality and pretend, and intentional blurring of that boundary with make-believe. And so when we are talking about performance and performance theory, I will let you know when I'm talking about make-believe or about theater, right? In looking at sort of theatrical performance in which people are behaving in a particular way as part of a scripted theatrical performance. However, I am always never talking about that type of performance in this class, because when we are thinking about performance and performance theory, we are talking about the way in which people enact their daily lives, and then how we see performance artists playing with that construct in the 60s and 70s, because they're the ones who develop and start these conversations about performance theory with Richard Schechner, with Judith Butler. So playing professional roles, gender and race roles, shaping one's identity, is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about performance and performance theory in this class. So when I'm talking about performance involved in social practices and advocacies, anthropological study, thinking about behaviors as the object of study here, this is what we're trying to study about people and individuals. It's kind of very anthropological in that we are looking at this performance of how you behave day to day in your own life. It doesn't make it false. It doesn't make it untrue. It doesn't make it valuable, but it's about why you do those things. And it's about breaking down the constructs of how we think about ourselves in society, right? Why do you put on makeup every day in the mirror in a particular way, in a particular order? Why do you wash your face? Why do you clean your dishes? Why do you do this? Why do you do that? It's all a construct of American society. And you'll see that when you move outside and look at other cultures and other people, there are a breakdown of those things, because they are not intrinsically biological to who we are as humans, right? To do particular things. And so I don't want you to ever think that that doesn't support ideas of fluid genders and non-binaries. In fact, it actually supports it. It directly supports those ideas in its entirety. It's the basis for how we understand why those things exist, why we can talk about these things, because there is no such thing as two set genders, and that's how it is, and that's how it's supposed to be biologically, right? Those are constructs. They're not reality. And so when we think about performance theory and social studies and behavior, this is what we are talking about. Why you sort of have these intrinsic behaviors based upon your gender. Why people ask women when you're going to have children. When people ask men, is that really your career choice? What are you doing to promote your career? Is that really going to support your family? These sort of constructs that when you hear them, you know that that's not how people should and have to behave. So think about that. because that is the core of how we're understanding Judith Butler's ideas. If you aren't understanding performance theory and how we're getting here, then you're missing gender performance as a whole. And twice behaved behaviors is core at Judith Butler's argument as well, because in fact, as I'm going to show you through talking about her article, the stylized repetition of acts is the very core of reiterating some of these gender norms that exist today, as Richard Schechner states with his twice behaved behaviors. So, but in everyday life also involves years of training, of learning appropriate bits of behavior, of finding out how to adjust and perform one's life in relation to social and personal circumstances. So I'm going to show you that here in this sort of first core argument, which is that this is what you really need to be getting from this article, is gender performity is based on social and historical structures already in place that are socially constructed. And that it is reiterated through stylized repetition of acts. And then these other elements build on her argument as well. But this is really what you need to be getting out of this argument, and out of what Judith Butler is saying about the fluidity of gender as a whole. So when she brings up Simone de Beauvoir in Second Sex in 1949, she's talking about how Simone de Beauvoir talks about woman as a historical situation. When Simone de Beauvoir, my French is so bad, claims one is not born but rather becomes a woman, she's appropriating and reinterpreting this doctrine of constituting acts from a phenomenological tradition. In other words, the body is a historical situation, as Beauvoir has claimed, and is a matter of doing, dramatizing, and reproducing a historical situation. So when someone becomes a woman and over time in their lives is slowly built with these ideas of oppression, of how women are supposed to behave and not supposed to behave based on femininity, on constructs of social life as a whole, that women are supposed to care for the children and to cook and to take care of life at home. All of these constructs are not something you are born with and that are biologically ingrained in who you are, but are rather built by societal ideas of how women are supposed to behave. So, as Butler states, feminist theory has often been critical of naturalistic explanations of sex and sexuality that assume that the meaning of women's social existence can be derived from some facts of their physiology. Body is a social and historical idea rather than a natural species. It is understood as an active process of embodying certain cultural and historical possibilities. So think about the beginning of time and how we are talking about male versus female roles. Why do these things exist? Why are they important? How does it then affect us even in the 21st century that we're still continuing to think about these roles as holding some kind of importance? And even if you as an individual don't think that those roles hold any value for you in particular, you are still affected by those things growing up, especially if you don't have a very supportive family of how you engage with your gender identity. So those things are still ingrained in how you live your life. So being a woman is a historical idea. But to be a woman is to become a woman, to compel the body to conform to an historical idea of woman, to induce the body to become a cultural sign, to materialize oneself in obedience to an historically delimited possibility, and to do this as a sustained and repeated corporeal project. The authors of gender become entranced by their own fictions, whereby the construction compels one belief in its necessity and naturalness. So people are conditioned to believe in some capacity that gender and sexuality is natural, right? That heterosexuality is natural because of religion or because of social constructs that are pervaded in society as a whole. And those things are continued into their lives when they're confused about why gay people want to get married or have rights, right? Like all this nonsense with Coney Barrett, you have to think that she's relying on the construct of gender being male versus female and the necessity and naturalist of those constructs, which is entirely not true. So societies encourage heterosexual norms to guarantee reproduction of a given culture through the continued creation of families and individuals. One might argue that without human beings whose various acts, largely construed, produce and maintain oppressive conditions, those conditions would fall away. So, why do we keep up these ideas if they're so intrinsically connected with oppression? Because we need to have babies, right? There is this fear about reproduction, about not continuing to create American-born citizens, right? If that even means anything. And you can see that even with the fear of these camps that we're keeping Mexican women and children in, where we are giving these women hysterectomies. Why in God's name does it matter that they want to force this oppression upon these women? Well, because at the core, they are thinking about eugenics, about trying to breed the right kind of Americans, right? All of these constructs that are so based in racism and oppression and prejudice, because they think that this is some sort of naturalist idea, right? And at the core, that's just based in historical oppression and racism. Whether or not they want to say they're racist or not doesn't really matter. So you can even think about institutional critique, right? When we talk about institutional critique, this doesn't just have to mean museums. This can be the critique of the institution of marriage, right? Is the institution of marriage solidified in heterosexual norms pervaded through fictions in society, right? And therefore, are we rethinking the construct of marriage and institutional critique through Butler's article? I've talked about this with some of my students, and again, moving back to this idea of reproduction as a commodity with Gerda Lerner, the creation of patriarchy, is that reproductive labor was key to men's subordination of women. Children helped the family produce more crops and become wealthier. Reproduction as a commodity, something purchased from a father when a young man's family paid a bride price to a young woman's family. So again, at the core, thinking about my best example, like I said, is the one-child policy in China, which is that we have the Chinese government wanting to reduce the population, and by doing so tells the Chinese population they can only have one child, which then causes this series of events where Chinese women only want to have boys because boys will carry on the family name, or not Chinese women necessarily, but Chinese families, because you'll see that Chinese women are probably the most traumatized by this sort of policy. But Chinese families want to have boys to carry on their name and to protect their family line, and thus they are killing their newborn female daughters because they need to have another child to have a son. And then what has now happened as these kids have grown up and the one-child policy has fallen away to now the two-child policy or something, that there are no women in Chinese society. There's an disproportionate amount of men to women, and that therefore you've created this entire population of people that are lonely, that are not engaging in relationships at all, because you have limited how many women are in society. And this is at its core completely kind of destroyed this sort of young population of Chinese men and women, where people are kidnapping women, Chinese women, to marry them because there are not enough Chinese women as a whole. I don't know the statistic. I should probably look it up. But if you go and watch any video, I think there's like a documentary about the one-child policy, about how this has created this intense divide because of the Chinese thinking about reproduction as a commodity, right? Reproduction as you need a man to carry on your family line and your family name. All of these things are inherently reenacted through the stylized repetition of acts. And through this sort of section of her argument is really where I think it's the easiest way to think about performance of gender as a whole. Okay, so what do I mean by being a woman is constituted in time through a stylized repetition of acts? Gender is instituted through the stylization of the body and hence must be understood as the mundane way in which bodily gestures, movements, and enactments of various kinds constitute the illusion of an embodying gender self. Body is a constant and incessant materializing of possibilities. In other words, the body is a historical situation, as Beauvoir has claimed, and is a manner of doing, dramatizing, and reproducing a historical situation. Gender is also part of social temporality, a performative accomplishment which the mundane social audience, including the actors themselves, come to believe and perform in the mode of belief. If the ground of gender identity is the stylized repetition of acts through time, and not a seemingly seamless identity, then the possibilities of gender transformation are to be found in the arbitrary relation between such acts, in the possibility of a different sort of repeating, in the breaking or subversive repetition of that style. So, the body as a set of possibilities signifies that its appearance in the world for perception is not predetermined by some manner of interior essence, and that its concrete expression in the world must be understood as the taking up and rendering specific set of historical possibilities. So, what in the world is Judith Butler talking about? This is about how over time you have this construct of thinking about how femininity and gender, masculinity as well, is constituted through historical constructs, through oppression. So fashion is really the easiest way to think about these things, and really sort of the most straightforward way that I think once you start understanding kind of fashion at its core as part of gender performance, then you start to sort of link those things up to other ideas. I would say that this is the most straightforward way to think about gender performance, because actions and reactions are also inherently part of that, and I'll show you that as well. I have a good example. But when you're thinking about how women dress historically, over and over and over, we have this idea about how women are supposed to look, how they're supposed to behave when they're dressed that way, that they're not supposed to be too slutty or revealing, not to show too much cleavage, that they're supposed to dress in a particular way that is not sexually alluring to men. If you ever had a talk like in your middle school about how, oh, well, you don't want men to see your cleavage because they'll be, sexually attracted to you, right? It's not about changing how boys behave. It's about changing how women dress and behave. And then those constructs are then put upon people who don't want to be part of those constructs. So people who don't want to dress in dresses or feminine clothes and are more androgynous, are trying to move outside of those historical stylized ideas. And those things change historically, right? What women are allowed to wear, what men are allowed to wear, that women weren't allowed to wear pants, right? Like, you have to think that while these things seem outdated in a lot of ways, they're also really kind of still ingrained in our culture as a whole. And even men, like when you think about what men have worn historically, what they've worn hasn't changed that much. They still wear suits and sweaters and pants, right? There haven't been these sort of massive changes in what men wear as a whole. It kind of stays in this circular mode. And so when I talk about stylized repetition of acts and what Judith Butler is referencing, in part, this is not the only thing that she's referencing, but part of it, and again, the sort of least complicated way to talk about gender performance, I think, is through clothing and sort of physical appearance. So the materiality of clothing, shoes, jewelry, makeup, toys, cars, colors, dresses versus pants, heels versus flat shoes, pink versus blue. And you can then continue to think about that through careers and the way of behaving and participating in everyday life, how a woman is supposed to act. We talk about how women are considered bitchy if they're too sort of strong and forceful, where men see that as being a good leader. Speech acts about language and gesture. The body is a source of this constant materializing of possibilities. The body is always an embodying of possibilities, both conditioned and circumscribed by historical convention. And therefore, again, bringing it back to this Beauvoir idea, which is a quote that I gave you before, reproducing a historical situation. I'm going to show you this here in a second, but let's think about this in the construct of what we've talked about here. So, performance. We have George Macinas and Billy Hutchings performing this Fluxus wedding. Why are they switching clothes during the wedding between male and female garb and switching wigs, right? So that George Macinas is wearing this long-haired wig, and then also wearing this dress and this corset. Oops, I'm sorry. As well. Because they are playing with these constructs of gender and marriage as a whole, right? What are these things? Why are they ingrained in our society? And in switching them, does it make a marriage or a wedding less valid? Even between a male and a female, right? Switching that the male wears the dress and the woman wears the suit. So recreating the wedding in this opposite direction makes you rethink how those things are constructed. Same with Carolee Schneemann when she pulls this scroll out of her vagina and she's running around in an apron, thinking about the roles of women in society as a whole, right? And you can think about Orlan or Marina Abramovic, all of them are playing with these constructs of the way women are treated and subjugated, and which sometimes causes rape and sexual assault because of this oppressive constructs and repetition in society. I was telling my students about this other good example, in my feminist class, where we have Rosa Bonner here, who is a famous artist in the Impressionist and Post-Impressionist eras, where Rosa Bonner here is painting these domestic scenes of cows and becomes very, very popular and important and becomes very famous for her work. And she actually goes and asks the police if she is allowed to dress in pants, because when she goes to these horse fairs and events, wearing a dress has sort of caused her to receive some harassment from the people there, sort of critiquing, why is this woman there? Why is she drawing us? And so by wearing pants and dressing as a man, she's able to go to these events with no harassment to paint these paintings. And so people talk about how this is such a bold statement about her profession. And she's one in 12 women who was allowed to wear trousers in the 1850s. But also this is part of the construct of who she is. And a lot of scholars don't necessarily reference this in particular, and I feel it kind of misses some of the point, which is that Rosa Bonheur, well, okay, so I read this, where did I read this line? That was silly. Rosa Bonheur did not want to get married because she feared, as too many young girls let themselves be led to the altar like lambs to the sacrifice, she maintained. And thus she kept up a platonic union with a fellow woman artist, Natalie Micus, who evidently provided her with the companionship and emotional warmth she needed. This is from Linda Nochlund's article, which is written in, I think, the 70s. Hold on. So in 71. So the 70s, like I said. So, and as we've talked about this in some of my classes here, is that she's gay, right? Like, she's a gay artist. She doesn't get married because she's in love with Natalie Micus. Why does she wear pants? Probably because she didn't want to be conforming to these constructs of femininity, right? This is not who she was as an individual, and she had to kind of lie about who she was and what she was doing because of the way society was built at the time. And not believing that this was part of her identity versus like her profession seems kind of like nonsense to me in a lot of ways, right? This is the doll that's made after her here. And she goes on to have another marriage to Anna Klumpke, or relationship, that is. But she had to keep justifying why she wore pants, right? Oh, I can put on a skirt. It's fine. She had to feel compelled to attack her less modest trouser-wearing sisters at the same time because of these fears about society and the way that they would judge her and treat her for playing with the sort of social constructs of gender and gender clothing. And you can see that these things are beginning to be broken down in movements like Surrealism and Dada, where we have Marcel Duchamp playing with his alter ego of Rose Salevi, as well as Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, really kind of playing with gender constructs as a couple, and Claude Cahun dressing more sexually ambiguous and engaging with these constructs of what gender means, what these roles mean as a whole. Cahun doesn't want to be tied down to one sort of particular gender identity or construct as a whole. You have Toyin, who's a big part of the Surrealist movement in, I believe, either the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia, depending on what year it is. But Toyin not wanting to be tied down to one particular gender, and thus takes up the name Toyin, which is supposed to be genderless, and engages with art and artistic practice in a genderless manner in Europe and abroad. Not to Judy Chicago yet. Here, hold on. When I talk about the Guerrilla Girls and the way that they dress, many of them dressing in kind of, especially in the 80s and 90s, dressing in overtly feminine clothing, although they all wear black. It often looks feminine, and they're using fishnets and other inherent sort of culturally feminine pieces of clothing while wearing this kind of overtly masculine gorilla mask, right? But wearing pearls and flowers, right? So they're engaging with kind of the silliness of gender performance and identity through clothing. They also do this with the way they write their letters in this kind of frilly cursive while also having a flower, as well as the gorilla hand even having painted nails. So thinking about these constructs of gender and playing with those constructs as well. You can think about Catherine Opie, where they photograph different people in the series. I should look at my notes and not just. Where Catherine Opie depicts friends in the lesbian and gay community in LA, mixing traditional portrait photography by giving their friends false facial hair to suggest the fluidity and complexity of gender. This was a very popular and important work in the 1990s, in playing with constructs of gender, in having sort of male and female and gender binary, lesbian, gay figures all sort of look a particular way and play with these constructs in Opie's work. As well as doing this as well in some of Opie's self-portraits and portraits of other friends and family members, where Opie photographs transgender women and men, drag queens, leather dykes, with this kind of great solemnity and formality, using this historical norms of studio portraiture to upend heterosexual norms of identity and sexuality, resisting sort of simple voyeurism. So taking these kind of strong and purposeful portraits and engaging with breaking down these constructs of heteronormative and gender norms as a whole. You can also see this in more sort of popular and famous artists, though Opie I would say is quite popular, but Cindy Sherman is one of those artists that everyone talks about. In her Untitled Film series, she creates this construct about looking at the roles of women through her entitled film stills, which is really what brings her to fame, in placing herself in roles of B-movie actresses, dressing up in wigs, hats, dresses, clothes, unlike her own, playing roles and characters. So this is where you can see kind of this theatrical look of performance, but also gender performance, right? She's kind of using this construct, and even maybe visuality of filmmaking, and putting it into her ideas about gender constructs. So these sort of types of women that exist. They're not actual people, they're self fabricated fictional ones, archetypes of housewives, prostitutes, a woman in distress, woman in tears, the dancer, the actress, the malleable chameleon like Sherman plays all these characters. I have a quote here: a hybrid of photography and performance art that reveals femininity to be an effect of representation. And Cindy Sherman has done this quite extensively with her Metro pictures, in which she plays kind of types of women as well, and um, other roles our culture kind of casts women in as a whole, breaking them down into sort of like starlet, matron, corpse, vamp, secretary, clown, etc. And then some of her recent work talking about um, aging what aging means for women in sort of using types of old Hollywood film stars like Gloria Swanson and Greta Garbo in their twilight years. Kind of like Sunset Boulevard, if you've ever seen that film. Thinking about how women's identity is formed, limited, how women, when they get older, aren't as valuable in films and TV, right? How many years do you have to be beautiful and to be represented in films? This other video that I have here is from an Always commercial, Like a Girl, which talks about sort of the constructs of behavior and what it means to sort of talk about something like a girl. That sort of sets up girls to think about sports and sort of athletic things in masculine terms. So I'll play that for you here.
Hi, Erin.
Hi.
Okay, so I'm gonna just give you some actions to do, and just do the first thing that comes to mind. Show me what it looks like to run like a girl.
My hair.
Show me what it looks like to fight like a girl. Now throw like a girl.
Aw. My name is Dakota, and I'm 10 years old.
Show me what it looks like to run like a girl. Throw like a girl. Fight like a girl. What does it mean to you when I say run like a girl?
It means run fast as you can.
So do you think you just insulted your sister?
No. I mean, yeah, insulted girls, but not my sister.
Is like a girl a good thing?
Actually, I don't know if it's a bad thing or a good thing. It sounds like a bad thing. It sounds like you're trying to humiliate someone.
So when they're in that vulnerable time between 10 and 12, how do you think it affects them when somebody uses like a girl as an insult?
I think it definitely drops their self-confidence and really puts them down, because during that time, they're already trying to figure themselves out. And when somebody says you hit like a girl, it's like, well, what does that mean? Because they think they're a strong person. It's kind of like telling them that they're weak and they're not as good as them.
And what advice do you have to young girls who are told they run like a girl, kick like a girl, hit like a girl, swing like a girl?
Keep doing it, because it's working. If somebody else says that running like a girl or kicking like a girl or shooting like a girl is something that you shouldn't be doing, that's their problem. Because if you're still scoring and you're still getting to the ball on time and you're still being first, you're doing it right. Doesn't matter what they say. I mean, yes, I kick like a girl and I swim like a girl and I walk like a girl and I wake up in the morning like a girl because I am a girl. And that's not something that I should be ashamed of. So I'm gonna do it anyway. That's what they should do.
If I asked you to run like a girl now, would you do it differently?
I would run like myself.
Would you like a chance to redo it?
Yeah.
Why can't run like a girl also mean win the race?
So that commercial really reflects on not only how gender is discussed sort of in clothing or any of these other elements that we could discuss, but also in sort of language, right? In the way that we talk to one another. Saying things like you should have some balls, or even like the way that we define and think about masculinity, that men have to have a good handshake, whatever that means, that those things are important, right? And it comes down to these sort of intrinsic cultural ideas about how masculinity and femininity are used in sort of language and culture as a whole. So, feminist theory and the second to the third wave of feminism sought to take individual acts and practices and situate them into the understanding of a broader and shared cultural context, and empowered women to know that they were not alone in their silence of anger. However, this idea surrounding the personal is political as part of the second wave of feminism really fails because it creates an underlying belief that all women want and need the same things. It is understandable desire to forge bonds of solidarity. Feminist discourses has often relied upon the category of women as a universal presupposition of cultural experience, which, in its universal status, provides a false ontological promise of eventual political solidarity. Yet in this effort to combat the invisibility of women as a category, feminists run the risk of rendering visible a category which may or may not be representative of the concrete lives of women. And this is probably very obvious today as we see all sorts of types of women and other people in general who want equality, and you have to think that none of those people are really the same, right? Black women and white women might not want the same thing. Trans women, gay people in general, right? Like, you can think about how, although the second wave is trying to be more inclusive, it's also using this construct of the personal as political, because they want to connect with people and other people, and people want to feel like they're not alone, but then it limits sort of the construct of what it means to believe those things in general. So it kind of limits to this idea that all women want and need the same things, which is not true at all. So, like I was saying this right here, it's hard to understand feminism fully as there's an underlying belief that all women want and need the same things. Women as a universal presupposition that they have political solidarity. I'm sure that there is more than one has often emerged in the recognition that my pain or my silence or my anger or my perception is finally not mine alone, and that it delimits me in a shared cultural situation, which in turn empowers me. So maybe the part that is in part confusing because of Judith Butler talking about performance in the theatrical sense and sort of stage performance that's scripted is that you can think about acts of gender bearing similarities to acts in theatrical contexts. The act that one does, the act that one performs, is, in a sense, an act that has one been going on before one arrived on the scene. Hence, gender is an act which has been rehearsed, much as a script survives the particular actors who make use of it, but which requires individual actors in order to be actualized and reproduced as reality once again. So in actuality, Butler is using theater and theater performance as like a metaphor for how we understand gender and constructs of gender and performance of gender, because they can be scripted on the body in the way that we talk, like talking about like a girl or handshake, but it's not at all like theater, right? Because there is this separation between reality and fiction, and with that drags queen story. So I'll talk about that in a second. But it keeps everyone in this binary frame, just as a script may be enacted in various ways, and just as the play requires both text and interpretation, so the gender body acts its part in a culturally restricted, corporeal space and enacts interpretations within the confines of already existing directives. And so Butler talks about this drag queen scenario, that people who do not conform to larger constructs of gender are often punished, right? And we don't mean that we punish each other, but that society punishes them for not being part of culture, cultural norms. And this is obviously changing, but it's not 100% changed, right? We still see hate crimes. And so the story that Judith Butler gives you is that when a crowd sees a drag queen on stage, they applaud. When an individual sees them on a bus, they are disgusted. So when you're on a stage, you can distinguish between play and real life, but cannot do this in public space. And this, of course, confirms this continued need of fear, right, amongst people who are queer, who are drag queens, who are non-binary, that there could always be this chance of experiencing hate crimes in some capacity because they are not following the gender norms of society at large. In effect, gender is made to comply with the model of truth and falsity, which is not only contradicts its own performative fluidity, but serves as a social policy of gender regulation and control. That culture so readily punishes or marginalizes those who fail to perform the illusion of gender. Essentialism should be sign enough that on some level there is a social knowledge that the truth or falsity of gender is only socially compelled and in no sense ontologically necessitated. So like I have been talking about, right, if you go and watch episodes of RuPaul's Drag Race, and when the queens are all getting ready in the mirrors and talking about the hate crimes and experiences that they have gone through being raised by people who didn't support them, like their parents or grandparents, you can see how much this idea about socially constructed gender still pervades people's lives, right? That even though these powerful drag queens that are on television, that are expressing their lives in a very open and social way, that some of them haven't even talked to their families or feel rejected by their families. I want to say that like Kimchi, had she not even told her family? I'm trying to remember now, but like you can see the difference between a family accepting and understanding that social and gender roles are not binary, and on the other hand, when people don't believe that, right, and treat their children as though they're doing something against God or against culture or etc. The heterosexual imperative enables certain sex identifications and forecloses and or disavows other identifications. Those regulatory schemas are not timeless structures, but historically revisable criteria of intelligibility, which produce and vanquish bodies that matter. Homosexual bodies, trans bodies, and others who do not fit into the correct definitions are outside the norm and considered unimportant. And so Judith Butler talks about these things and is trying to break down how people actually understand them. I think I still have this video here. And once you hear Judith Butler talk, maybe it'll help you more with understanding her writing, because the way she writes is a little... Sorry about that. The way that she performs is much... Or I'm sorry. The way that she talks is more easy to understand than her writing.
It's one thing to say that gender is performed, and that's a little different from saying gender is performative. When we say gender is performed, we usually mean that we've taken on a role, we're acting in some way, and that our acting or our role playing is crucial to the gender that we are and the gender that we present to the world. To say that gender is performative is a little different, because for something to be performative means that it produces a series of effects. We act and walk and speak and talk in ways that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. You know, I was walking down the street in Berkeley when I first arrived several years ago, and a young woman who was, I think, in high school leaned out of her window and she yelled, "Are you a lesbian?" And she was looking to harass me. Or maybe she was just freaked out, or she thought I looked like I probably was one and wanted to know. But instead I just turned around and I said, "Yes, I am." And that really shocked her. We act as if that being of a man or that being of a woman is actually an internal reality or something that's simply true about us, a fact about us. Actually, it's a phenomenon that's being produced all the time and reproduced all the time. So to say gender is performative is to say that nobody really is a gender from the start. I know it's controversial, but that's my claim. Think about how difficult it is for sissy boys, or how difficult it is for tomboys to function socially without being bullied or without being teased or without sometimes suffering threats of violence, or without their parents intervening to say, maybe you need a psychiatrist, or why can't you be normal? So, there are institutional powers like psychiatric normalization, and there are informal kinds of practices like bullying, which try to keep us in our gendered place. There's a real question for me about how such gender norms get established and policed, and what the best way is to disrupt them and to overcome the police function. It's my view that gender is culturally formed, but it's also a domain of agency or freedom. It's most important to resist the violence that is imposed by ideal gender norms, especially against those who are gender different, who are non-conforming in their gender presentation.
So I hope that gives you some clarity, because I think Butler is very articulate in these ideas and thinking about sort of gender performativity specifically. And I know that the terms can be sort of confusing, but it's okay to not get it right every time. But one of these sort of ending thoughts that Butler sends us with is about sex being culturally defined as gender. So because sex and gender are so culturally ingrained in our dialogue, they become almost sort of inseparable. Indeed, if gender is the cultural significance that the sex body assumed, and if that significance is co-determined through various acts and their cultural perception, then it would appear that from within the terms of culture, it is not possible to know sex as distinct from gender. So almost to this extent that gender and sex become so intertwined that they're almost impossible to separate. So when you say, oh yes, there's a difference between sex, which is male versus female, versus gender, which is your gender identity, it's almost to the extent now in our culture that sex and gender have become so intertwined that people just can't divide them. And I also give you examples here of the way that gender performativity is sort of promoted through gender reveal parties, which I think are silliness, like these ideas like touchdowns are tutus, ties are tutus, like those are the things that separate males and females, nuts versus no nuts. And I get that these things are like supposed to be comedic in some way, but I find them really freaking weird. Because again, like you are trying to determine your sex or gender of your child, when that isn't really, I don't know. It just seems like a lot of hoopla over something that's sort of silly, right? To give girls pink clothes and boys blue clothes and certain types of boys and girls toys. In 2019, Jenna Carvundius, considered one of the pioneers of gender reveal parties, said, I started to realize that non-binary people and trans people were feeling affected by this, and I started to feel bad that I had released something bad into the world, and that people have to evaluate this practice, especially after this fire was started in California because of it, but that these things are really not a legitimate conversation about what your sex or gender of your child is going to be. And maybe it's fun and silly and whatever, but it doesn't really mean anything. And maybe inherently it actually is more hurtful. This is a definition of gender performativity by Miriam Meyerhoff. The performative quality of gender and sexuality is distinct from the gendered and sexualized performance. If a performance is something controlled and possibly categorized by a degree of artifice, performativity is talking about something completely different. To say that gender is performative is simply to say that how we understand gender and how we position ourselves as gendered or sexual beings in relations to others is achieved through the repetition and enactment of these activities. The fact that our community sees these acts as gendered is what makes them so, not the fact that lesbian women or heterosexual men as a given enact them. So gender reality is performative, which means quite simply that it is real only to the extent that it is performed. The gender reality is created through sustained social performances, means that the very notion of an essential sex, a true or abiding masculinity, or strategy by which the performative aspect of gender is concealed. Gender is therefore not true or false, neither real or apparent, in the construct of male versus female, man versus woman. And yet one is compelled to live in a world in which genders constitute univocal signifiers, in which gender is stabilized, polarized, rendered discrete, and intractable. Thus, these political and oppressive structures are continuously maintained. Regardless of the pervasive character of patriarchy and the prevalence of sexual difference as an operative cultural distinction, there's nothing about a binary gender system that is given. Gender is not passively scripted on the body and is it determined by nature, language, the symbolic, or an overwhelming history of patriarchy? Gender is what is put on invariably under the constraint, daily and incessant with anxiety and pleasure. But if this continuous act is mistaken for a natural or linguistic given, power is relinquished to expand the cultural field bodily through subversive performances of various kinds. So continuing to remember that gender is performative. It is not intrinsically part of who people are and necessarily who they want to be or need to be. And thinking about this and remembering these constructs will continue to help you remember how society is dictated through historical practices and sort of oppression as well. I was trying to see if any of my examples were good. I think I'm just going to stick with the ones we put on here. So as we look at these things, and hopefully we'll continue to break it down, and we'll kind of talk about queer performativity as well in the coming weeks, and sort of other examples and ideas surrounding this. But keep thinking about it. Keep thinking about what Judith Butler's trying to say and really get to the core, because her arguments are complicated, but they're very valuable and important to how we understand and think about ourselves as a whole. So hopefully this helped, and we can sort of move forward and talk more about these elements in the future. And if not, I'll give you more examples, and we'll do it until you guys have a good understanding of gender performativity.